My name's Ian Davis. I'm Professor of Medicine and Head of the Eastern Health Clinical School at Monash University in Australia. I'm a medical oncologist, which is a cancer specialist, and I also have the privilege of being Chair of ANZUP Cancer Trials Group. ANZUP stands for the Australian and New Zealand Urogenital and Prostate Cancer Trials Group, which is a bit of a mouthful. We call it ANZUP for short. Urogenital and prostate means cancers of the urinary tract. So we're talking about prostate cancer, kidney cancer, bladder cancer and testicular cancer mainly. ANZUP has members in every state and territory of Australia, in New Zealand as the name suggests, and also internationally. To be a member of ANZUP you need to be a person who is involved in the care of people with cancer as a clinician or in the research of these conditions. ANZUP is made up of a group of clinicians, researchers and members of the community from all sorts of different areas. Amongst the clinicians, for example, there are medical oncologists, the cancer specialists, radiation oncologists who give radiotherapy, urologists who perform the surgery, there are scientists, there are psychologists, there are nurses, there are consumers, there are people who keep track of where the cancers are happening and how often they're happening, and there are people who are doing the basic research. We can't do the work that we need to do without bringing all of these people together. And the beauty of ANZUP is that we do bring them all together in a very productive way, and we can ask questions that are broader than simply, does this drug shrink cancer? We can ask many more questions than that, and all of those things go to improve the outcomes for our patients. We also have a very active consumer advisory panel where members of the community are appointed by the ANZUP board to provide us advice on what the key issues are for the community and to help us communicate back to the community the results of our research. They also play a very important role in advocacy and also in fundraising. ANZUP looks after cancers of the urinary tract: prostate cancer, kidney cancer, bladder cancer and testicular cancer. Two of those cancers only happen in men, so men's health is a very important thing for us. Prostate cancer is the commonest cancer in Australia. Even if you count women, it's the commonest cancer, and women don't get prostate cancer. Testicular cancer is the commonest cancer that occurs in young men. So even though it's very curable, it causes a lot of problems for young men and a large burden on society in terms of treatment. Bladder cancer and kidney cancer occur in women as well, and we see roughly around 3,000 cases of each of those every year. We need to improve outcomes for these sorts of cancers for everybody. ANZUP has very productive links with other groups internationally. We've already performed clinical trials with groups in the United Kingdom. We work closely with Canada, the United States, regional areas around the Asia-Pacific area. We're going to continue to evolve those links. We have trials active currently and others in planning that are going to involve cooperative groups elsewhere around the world. The people who are doing the clinical trials in ANZUP, the clinicians and everybody else involved, are not paid for this work. This is all work that they're doing as part of their normal day-to-day practice. It does cost money though. Each blood test we do needs to be paid for. Each scan we do needs to be paid for. These sorts of things require resources that we just don't have. None of this results in any money that is going into any of our pockets. All of the resources that ANZUP receives are passed directly on to perform the clinical trials and to improve outcomes for our patients. I'm a scientist as well as a clinician, so I do basic research in the lab, and I think that's very important. We don't make any advances in medicine without understanding the basic biology of the diseases that we're looking after. But in the end, none of that research means very much if we can't turn it into a new treatment that's going to improve the human condition. It doesn't matter if we understand genes as well as they can possibly be understood if people still die of cancer. So where ANZUP is different from other types of research is that we're taking these sorts of discoveries, this sort of knowledge, and we're turning it into new treatments that are going to be a benefit for our patients. A clinical trial is basically where you're trying to work out the effect of some form of intervention on a group of people with a defined condition. That's the technical explanation. The simplest way to think about it would be perhaps you've got a new drug that you think is going to work in cancer. You want to know how safe it is, how often it works, how often it shrinks the cancer. Does it make people live longer? Is it safe? Does it make them feel better? And how does it stack up against the standard treatments that we already use? The clinical trials we do all require specific funding in order to do them. We need to be able to pay the nurses and the doctors and the hospitals and the laboratories that do the work that we need to have done for the clinical trials. Where does that money come from? Well, let's say, for example, that I get an idea in March of how to cure prostate cancer. The sad thing is in March, that's past the closing date for National Health and Medical Research Council grant submissions. So I can't submit that grant until the following year, 12 months later. I don't find out about the outcome of that grant until the end of that year. That's 18 months after my first idea. I've got probably a less than 20% chance of getting that grant money, even if it's a really good application. And if I do, it'll start the year after. That's actually 2 years after I had that idea about how to cure prostate cancer. In that time, something like 16,000 men will have experienced prostate cancer, and many of them will have died of it. The sort of clinical trials that ANZup does is different to what industry does. A pharmaceutical company will come along with some form of new drug which they're trying to get to market and to sell so that they can get benefit for their shareholders. That's a very good thing. If a drug company were to cure cancer, we'd all be very happy about that. We, as a group, look at our patients and we see where the clinical need is. We also look at the science and we see this is what's coming through. And ANZup, because we're not a pharmaceutical company, we're not supported by that sort of activity, we can do the clinical trials that actually answer the sorts of questions we think are important. Sometimes that might mean using drugs from more than one company. Sometimes it might mean a clinical trial that doesn't use a drug at all, or a drug that's out of patent and so a company's not going to be interested in developing it. Basically, we do the sorts of clinical trials that we think need to be done and that the drug companies can't do or won't do. Clinical trials, clinical research is very expensive. A drug company, for example, might be said to spend over $1 billion to get a drug to market. That's a lot of money. We obviously don't have the resources to do that sort of work. So we have to work more intelligently. ANZUP as a group is supported by funding through Cancer Australia, which is a federal government initiative. We're also supported by fundraising and various other aspects. But much of that money is used to support the operations of the group. We're not allowed to use any of the Cancer Australia money to actually do the clinical trial, for example. So each time we get an idea, we need to go out and find the resources to do that study. It might be through a grant, it might be through fundraising and donations, it might be through support from a company. But we have to get the resources to do those clinical trials for each and every project. We're very conscious that there are many other groups raising funds in this area. Organisations like the Cancer Council, Movember, Prostate Cancer Foundation of Australia, these are all wonderful organisations doing fantastic work, and there are some areas of overlap with the sorts of things that we're doing. Where we are distinct and where we are doing things that others are not doing is in the area of clinical trials. None of these other organisations are actually doing the clinical trials that will lead to the evidence that is going to make a difference to our patients. There are a number of ways that people in the community can get involved in research. Maybe the most obvious one is, if you're going to see your doctor, ask them, is there a clinical trial that might be suitable for me? There might not be, but if there is, it might be something that's very useful as part of your treatment. Second thing we want people to do is to advocate for support for more research, because there simply is not enough resource out there to do the sort of work that we want to do. So people need to be talking to their politicians and to their support groups and to their doctors and to their local members of parliament to make sure that medical research is well funded. A lot of people are confused about what it means to take part in a clinical trial. Basically, the process would be that you would sit down and talk with your doctor about what options might be available for you, and that includes all of the standard options. And for some people, the option of a clinical trial might also be there for you to consider. Your doctor would go through all the information related to that clinical trial, what it involves in terms of your time, the tests that are done, how many visits to hospital, the side effects of treatment, all of those sorts of things. And if you agreed that it was something that you wanted to consider, you'd be asked to sign a consent form. Now, a consent form's not a mortgage. All it means is that you're giving permission for the doctors to collect information about you in the context of the clinical trial. You might also be giving permission for a drug to be used in a way that it's not ordinarily used, or perhaps to use an experimental drug. You then take part in the clinical trial, and as you do that, if for any reason you want to come off the clinical trial, you can at any time. We obviously encourage people not to, unless there's a good reason, but you're able to do that. So you're not locked into things. All you're doing by providing that signature is giving us permission to collect the information and to conduct the clinical trial the way it's been described to you. There are various sorts of clinical trials. If you're on a clinical trial that involves a drug treatment, for example, quite often that might require visits to hospital to have the treatment given to you. On the other hand, if it's a treatment that's taken by mouth, it's something that might be easy to take, a lot of the time you'll be at home and you might just visit the hospital to make sure that everything's going well, that there's been no side effects, that there's no changes that need to be made to your treatment. There are some clinical trials that don't involve treatment. Some of the trials that we're doing, for example, involve supportive care questions. In other words, how well people manage with the diagnosis of cancer and how can we support people better through the process of treatment and what happens afterwards, all the survivorship questions. In that case, there might be very few visits to the hospital. Some of these things might be able to be done online or by telephone. ANZUP has a strong record of successful clinical trials. A lot of these are the sorts of things that don't involve big blockbuster drugs. As an example, in testicular cancer, we did a clinical trial several years ago that showed that giving the usual drugs one way was actually better than giving it another way. It doesn't sound very interesting, but you think about this. This is a common cancer. These are drugs that are not making big amounts of dollars for a drug company, so they're not going to do these sorts of questions. ANZUP did a clinical trial comparing the two types of treatment, and we showed that one was in fact better than the other. This is now the standard way that this treatment is given around the world. We're now performing a clinical trial in a condition called non-muscle invasive bladder cancer. This is a very, very common condition where there are cancerous cells on the inside lining of the bladder which have not yet grown through the wall of the bladder and spread elsewhere. This is not the type of cancer that kills people, although if it's left alone, it can turn into a dangerous sort of cancer. But it is a type of cancer that causes a lot of problems for people and a lot of cost to the community. And there's been very little research done on how to treat this type of cancer better. An idea came up through our bladder subcommittee, was talked about by the members of that committee, was expanded upon, was put in as a grant submission, was ranked very highly and was funded by the federal government to study this condition of non-muscle invasive bladder cancer. And this is going to be a very successful clinical trial. If for no other reason, then we'll have people all over Australia treating this condition in a uniform way. We hope also, of course, to show better outcomes from this cancer. Every dollar, whether it's a small amount or a large amount that's raised through fundraising, goes directly to support our research programs. That might be a large-scale clinical trial, in the case of a large donation. Small donations might go to support some of the aspects of a clinical trial that we would not otherwise be able to support. Some of the laboratory studies, some of the questionnaires that might be done, the things that are less expensive but are no less important than the rest of the study. In the whole of the 20th century, there were maybe 4 or 5 times when there really was a true breakthrough, when the whole field leaped forward by a huge amount. Things like the discovery of chemotherapy or new classes of drugs that were very effective in cancers that previously could not be cured. But the reality is that most progress is made in small steps, and that's where clinical trials come in. We have to get the evidence so that we understand better ways of doing things. Sometimes the old way is a better way of doing things. Just because something new doesn't mean it's the new and better and best way of doing something. We have to compare it against what we know and to make sure that we are doing the right thing for our patients.